chief rival of Xerxes, his great-great-grandson Darius the First, who ruled the Persian Empire about 100 years after the story of Esther unfolds. And like his Persian counterpart, Alexander was given over to wealth, flattery, sexual conquest. They were men of godlike stature, that whenever they would go out into the public, people would lower their eyes, look away, bow to them in a sense of giving them the respect that they deserved. Well, after a successful military campaign, Alexander traveled to the city of Corinth, and he was greeted there by all sorts of statesmen and educated elites who were tripping over themselves to heap praises on him, to offer their congratulations. But there was one notable exception to this. The controversial philosopher Diogenes Laertius. He was one of the founders of the school of cynicism, who believed that the path to wisdom and virtue lay in kind of eschewing all of the social constraints, things like wealth and status and power and glory and concern for what other people thought. And he was kind of like an ancient iconoclast, kind of like a performance artist sort of thing. He would sleep in Corinth in a large ceramic jar. And he would walk around in broad daylight with a lantern, saying that he was looking for one honest man in a corrupt society. So, picture the kind of guy you got there. And Alexander, for his part, he was a lover of wisdom. He was tutored by Aristotle until he was 16 years old. And so he saw wisdom and virtue as things to be cultivated. So he decided to seek out this famed philosopher and social critic just to kind of see who he was. Who is this man who would dare not come into my presence? And as the story goes, Alexander found Diogenes in the city, lying in rags, soaking up the sun. And as he approached him, he said, "I am Alexander. I can give you anything your heart desires. Tell me, is there anything you want?" To which Diogenes replied, "Yes. I'd like you to stand out of my sunlight." And then looked away, completely uninterested. And the historian Plutarch notes that Alexander turned to his entourage and said to them, "If I were not Alexander the Great, I would like to be Diogenes." He was so impressed by this man who lived in freedom. Freedom to not be bound up in the concern for what people thought. And he admired that. He did not live in the tyranny of other people's approval or esteem. But for most of us, I think that's where we tend to live our lives. We work hard to gain the favor and estimation of others. We want to be celebrated. We want to be admired. We want to be seen for the things that we do well, because deep down we believe that this is the way to be known and to be loved. And for many of us, that approval we seek is either from a person or from a guild. We work long hours. We spread ourselves thin either because that approval meets a sort of felt need in our lives, or it allows for some sort of career advancement that we crave. And for others, and it doesn't matter how old you are, sometimes that, we're living under the shadow of a father wound or a mother wound, and you spend a good chunk of your life trying to do things to secure the approval that you never got. And sometimes you're even aware that that is what is going on with you. Maybe it's a spouse. Or maybe it's your children. Or maybe it's that expression somewhere between concern and judgment that your dental hygienist gives to you when asks, "How often have you flossed?" And you say, "Oh, like every week." Liar. In any case, our energy gets directed toward gaining favor, acceptance, or just being liked by the people around us. In his book, Status Anxiety, the philosopher Alain de Botton describes the modern condition like this: "The attentions of others matter to us because we are afflicted by a congenital uncertainty as to our own value. As a result of which affliction, we tend to allow others' appraisals to play a determining role in how we see ourselves. Our sense of identity is held captive by the judgments of those we live among. Our minds are susceptible to the influence of external voices telling us what we require to be satisfied. Voices that may drown out the faint sounds emitted by our own souls and distract us from the careful, arduous task of accurately naming our priorities. I think that's true for a lot of us. And so the question then is, how do you live a life of courage, conviction, compassion, and wisdom that's free from the need for others' approval, or that does not disappear the moment that they stop approving? Particularly when the structures of how that approval is given are, running counter to the goodness, the beauty, the truth and joy of the kingdom of God. And don't get me wrong, it's not as though being well regarded by others is a bad thing, but there is a danger when it becomes the lens through which we view the significance of our lives. Well, the action of chapter 5 in Esther takes place at two banquets that tell two very different stories of how to find a center that holds. Esther receives approval and favor from Xerxes, to be sure, and his power and his position have a lot to say in determining the future of her people. And yet she is determined not to allow that approval to determine her choices, because she has found an identity and a sense of belonging that runs much deeper. And then on the other hand, at the end of the chapter, there's Haman, who receives great honor, but cannot enjoy that honor because he is controlled helplessly by the opinion of one man. And so we'll pick up this morning in chapter 5. Haman has used Mordecai's slight as a pretext for the destruction of the Jewish people, and after a period of fasting and mourning, Esther takes up the cause of her people. We are in chapter 5, starting in verses 1 through 8. And let us hear what the Spirit is saying to the church this morning. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God indeed. If Esther were a musical, it would be really tempting to make chapter 5 the kind of show-stopping moment. This is the place where she turns from a timid and passive beauty to a strong and self-possessed queen. It's a bit like Elsa singing "Let It Go," right? It's the moment when she takes control of everything. But I would suggest actually that the real moment of transformation takes place behind the scenes, in the 3 days of the fasting and in the prayers that traditionally accompany that fasting. The king has not seen her in 30 days, and if she goes, she may lose whatever favor she has, and she is fearful. But the transformation happens when she empties herself, not in the moment, but in the preparation for the moment. And the story is deliberately silent about what takes place on those 3 days, but we do know that it happens all in the shadow of the Passover. And so you have to wonder if somewhere in those 3 days she began to remember the stories of her upbringing. How on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw a ram caught in the thicket. How Joseph gathered his brothers together and after 3 days, he became reconciled to them. How Jonah was sheltered from the chaos of the sea and restored to his calling on the third day. And how the prophet Hosea prophesied the rebirth of his people on the third day. One ancient rabbinic commentator notes that in the Bible, Israel is never subject to trouble for more than 3 days. And maybe these 3 days of fasting, buoyed up by the prayers of her people, are enough to convince her that she is part of a larger story than the one that Persia is telling. And remembering that story, she gains the courage to make her move. So that by the time that the curtain opens up on Act 2, she doesn't go to Xerxes to gain confidence. She goes in the kind of confidence that comes when you are no longer subject to that person's approval. She is rightly using the position she has after she has reclaimed her identity with the people of the covenant. And so the outcome is not so much just about her skill and opportunity, but also about the wisdom and practices of her people. The biblical scholar Karen Jobes, who we've referenced a lot of times throughout this series, points out this. Esther assumes the dignity and power of her royal position only after she claims her true identity as a woman of God. As a result of her decision to identify with God's people, she was personally transformed to the full dignity, courage, and power to be what she already was, the Queen of Persia. And this is important because the same thing applies to us. You also likely have position or influence or standing in the place where God has placed you. And the question is, how are you using it? Do you see the things that you have been given, the privileges you enjoy, the status, whatever it might be, as something ultimately that is self-serving, or do you steward that power for the sake of others? Because it's only when we are free from the need to fit into a storyline that others or that our culture prescribes for us that we can have the proper confidence to use that influence well. This is when the prayer on earth as it is in heaven gets its teeth, when our sense of self is not tied up in the perception of others, but is instead firmly rooted, anchored in the community of God and the continuing story of God's action in the world. Suddenly, when that happens, we begin to see our position, all that we have, all that we are, as the means by which God's action starts to happen again in the world, and part of how that story gets moving along. My spiritual director said something last May that I think about often. He said, it's very hard to love people from whom you desperately need something. And I was like, why would you say that to me? Like, what's going on here? Now, he meant that in the context of leadership, but I think that generally holds, that it's only after you are free from your own pathology that you can even see the needs of others around you. And so Esther goes not knowing whether she will live or she will die, yet confident that her life is given over to an end that is much larger than she can imagine. Definitely larger than her own plans. And so with the background of this confidence, she proceeds also with great wisdom. In chapter 4, we are made aware of a complication that we've got to find a way to get around. Persian law makes it illegal for anyone to come to the throne unannounced. The penalty is death. There's a bas-relief in the ancient city of Persepolis that kind of depicts this scene. You can see the king there sitting on his throne, golden scepter is in hand. You can see somebody who has approached, looks like he's got a little bit of a surprised look on his face. And then you see the dudes with spears ready to take care of what happens. I don't think that story's going to end well. Don't really know. But it's just one of those details that adds a little bit of drama to the storyline. It's kind of a bit like I worked at a really large church and at one point, and it's like trying to get in to see the senior pastor. Like, we just have Mary. She's very nice. Like, it's much easier process here. But you'll notice that Esther literally puts on royalty. She doesn't barge in. She shows great restraint, first by appearing on the edge of the court just so as to catch the king's eye. And then the moment that Xerxes sees Esther, he raises the golden scepter, indicating that he likes what he sees, and she obliges by touching the tip of the scepter. Now, almost every commentary I read pointed out that there's some naked innuendo going on here. So if that's where your mind went, just know that your imagination can still be sanctified. It's not, you're not alone in that. If you don't know what I'm talking about at all, then blessed are the pure in heart. At any rate, the NIV kind of obscures the point a little bit. It's not just that she pleases the king. Literally, she wins the favor of the king. And there's a contrast that we are meant to see here. In chapter 1, Vashti blocks the king's request to appear in her royal clothes before the court when she is summoned. And the consequence of her blocking this request is that she is banished. Esther comes in with her royal clothes without being summoned, and she finds favor. And the point is not so much to argue the merits of Vashti's refusal or whether that's justified or not. It's just that the result is exclusion. She no longer has access. She no longer has influence. Esther, on the other hand, proves to be a pretty shrewd political operator. And it's just one of those small reminders that we deal with the world that we have, not the one that we would like to have. The world we live in is inescapably political as well as personal. And how we show up in the world actually matters. Again, some of us have privilege, some of us have position. And refusing to use those to play it safe, it might keep you safe, but it also keeps you out of the game, like Vashti. But when you do play the game, when you do get in there and use those places of influence, that power that you do have, you also have to know that you're not doing it on your home turf. The rules of the court are like a complicated game where there are certain sets of givens. And so Esther chooses to kind of play with those rules. She improvises. She plays the rules on the one hand. She shows up in her royalty, but she also pushes them to the limit, coming in unannounced, making an offer, but doing so in a way that shows that she's willing to accept the rules, even if that means her own death. And all the while she's hoping that this will lead to something more. And I think this is just the complicated nature of Christian engagement in the world. James Davidson Hunter puts it like this: faithful presence in our spheres of influence does not imply passive conformity to the established structures. Rather, within the dialectic between affirmation and antithesis, the saying yes and the no, faithful presence means a constructive resistance that seeks new patterns of social organization that challenge, undermine, and otherwise diminish oppression, injustice, enmity, and corruption, and in turn encourage harmony, fruitfulness, and abundance, wholeness, beauty, joy, security, and well-being. In the normal course of social life, the challenge and alternative that faithful presence entails is not so much a direct opposition through a contest of power, but a bursting out of an alternative within the proper space of the old. I reminded of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he describes standing kind of at the crossroads between these forces of complacency that are ground down by years of oppression and also the forces of bitterness and hatred rising from resentment and anger at the injustice of African Americans in this country. And straddling these two forces, taking that holy discontent and channeling it into the creative action of nonviolent direct action. This was an act of theological improvisation. Exposing unjust laws, pushing them to their limits, exploiting them, showing them for what they are. And in so many ways, this is the background and the environment in which the book of Esther is set. And by engaging in her own improvisation, Esther begins to carve out a new possibility for her people in the shell of one that is bent on their destruction. And she weaves together God's purposes with just the right amount of seduction and statesmanship to open up this new possibility. The king asks, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be given to you." So dramatic. Almost as dramatic as the World Series right now. I love it. I had to get that in there somewhere. I'm on cloud 9 today, so. And you would think, right, that this is the moment that, she's kind of navigated shrewdly, she's risked her life, and she's been given essentially a blank check. You would think that this is the moment, right, where she shoots her shot. But she waits. "Wisely and slow," writes Shakespeare, "they stumble that run fast." So she bides her time. With too much on the line, there's no room for mistake. And so she reads the room. The offer of half the kingdom is just something that kings say when they're feeling frisky. She knows her husband to be impulsive. She knows him to be brash. She knows him to be kind of allergic to, paying the consequences of his actions and just kind of pushing it off. She knows that he is easily swayed by his advisors. She's trying to figure out what is the gambit by which I can turn all of that stuff into my advantage. And so she plays coy a little bit. She does not match his high status offer with a high status request. Instead, she takes the posture of humility, showing deference, lowering her own status. "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." Again, this is a man who loves power, who loves flattery, who loves extravagance and dramatic gestures. Mentioning king 3 times in one sentence certainly plays to his ego. And it sets the stage for a banquet, which, as I mentioned a few weeks earlier, we know from the Greek historian Herodotus, is the place where all of the action takes place in the Persian Empire. They do not make decisions without getting seriously drunk. And so Esther has been around long enough to know how this works. And so she shows the wisdom of great restraint. Maybe you know what it's like to get a little bit emotionally ahead of your circumstances, where you commit to a course of action before your mind has actually, sized up the situation that you're in, and you launch out into a place where you should have been building a bridge. And maybe that's because we tend to think of courage as something that keeps a single-eyed focus on results, something that marshals the power to knock down whatever obstacles come at us. Fortune favors the bold, definitely not the meek. And while there's a place for that kind of strength, meekness and humility are not the opposite of strength. Instead, they are what strength looks like when it's under control. And meekness and humility, they have their own kind of wisdom, knowing when to say and do and when not to say and do. And this is the posture that Esther assumes. And the situation kind of looks like this. If she tells the king now, she'll do it while Haman is not there. And we've already seen how Xerxes can be swayed by his advisors and act rashly. And Esther is kind of the counterpoint of all this. So she uses every tool at her disposal, her dignity, her beauty, her intelligence and wisdom, patiently to kind of draw him in. The king says in verse 5, "Bring Haman at once, that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? And it will be given to you. And what is your request?" He's really curious at this point. "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." And I think of this as she's kind of gotten him to the table. She's even gotten him to ante up quite a bit here. But the pot is not quite enough. The fate of her people is at stake. And so she delays, she introduces some suspense, some secrecy. I mean, what kind of person, after all, has the presence of mind to refuse half of the kingdom being offered twice in one day. And so she just kind of reels him in. Xerxes is being teased, and he loves it. I mean, he isn't a bit of a sucker for some flirty intrigue, right? And then her language gets really, really precise. My petition and my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. And with a few well-placed words, she has crafted a scenario where simply by showing up, he is already committed to doing whatever she asks. And the best part of it is she makes it seem like it's his idea. Oh, I will do what you say. I will answer the question you've been just dying to get out of me. I mean, how good is that, right? And so she is like slow playing her hand, constantly checking her cards against her opponent, waiting for him to go all in. And in the space of just one day, she goes from facing a tragic but noble death to having the power of the empire eating out of her hand, so that by the time all of the cards are face up on the table, neither Xerxes nor Haman are aware that she has turned a king and a joker into a royal flush. Yeah, I was pretty happy with that line when I wrote it. Please, I need your approval. No. And again, I think we see in this scene, like in the deliverance of her people, a foretaste of the gospel. For those who follow Jesus, the storyline as it unfolds here is dripping with all sorts of similarities to Jesus' life and death and resurrection. I love how the theologian Sam Wells captures it all. He writes, Esther begins her quest on the third day, a key anticipation of Easter. She wears royal robes just as Jesus wore a purple robe. She inhabits the court of the king's palace just as Jesus wended his way between the high priest's house and the governor's quarters. Most significantly, she lays down her life so that her people may be saved, embodying within her the failings and hopes of the Jews, yet placed like no other Jew to intercede on their behalf because she has both the trappings of majesty and a body subject to decay and death. She is to be the lamb that brings Passover freedom. She is to discover the miracle that recalls the Exodus. And not only that, but the careful means by which she draws her enemy in and then turns the table is like Jesus facing the grave only to defeat death on its own turf. And like Jesus, the story turns when the one who wears the crown does not see royal status as something to be used for her own advantage, but instead awash in the memory and the practices of her people. Strengthened by their prayers and by their fasting, Esther comes in humility. And she comes in the hope of a promise that anchors her to the character of God, to God's faithfulness, to the one who chose and claimed her people to be the ones through whom the salvation of the world would come. The providence of God works in and through careful planning and brilliant strategy. And God may be arranging the deck, all that stuff behind the scenes, but it still falls on Esther to play the game with wisdom and with grace. And her ability to do so is immediately then contrasted with Haman, whose sense of self makes no room for transcendence. It is entirely wrapped up in the imminence of the palace. Verse 9 continues like this. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. He's come to this moment where he has arrived. He has value. He has honor. He's invited to dine in the presence of royalty. And one would think that that is enough. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. And suddenly we see how fragile the approval and validation of others really is. I mean, Haman goes on in the story to gather all of his friends, to boast about all of his riches, to boast about how many sons he has, how many accolades and advancements to his career he has been given. And all of that is true. But all he can see is Mordecai sitting at the king's gate saying, hey, get out of my son. He's already signed Mordecai's death warrant, but his refusal to turn away just, it works on his soul like a splinter. All of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. It's a subtle retelling of Adam and Eve in the garden who have all the world to enjoy, but only see the thing that he can't have. And so if Haman is the incarnation of evil in chapter 3, in chapter 5, he emerges in this story as the embodiment of sin. He has abundance, he can only see scarcity. He has the opportunity to live out of joy, but he chooses to live out of pride and fear. And it's a cautionary tale that if your well-being rises with your estimation in the eyes of others, it will also fall with your estimation in the eyes of others as well. And if your sense of self is tied to how others view you, then also is your joy. And to one degree or another, we all fall into this. Those of you who are Enneagram 3s, maybe a little more than others. But it's one thing to hear, a theological proposition that you are a being of inestimable dignity because you bear the marks of your Creator, the image of God. It's one thing to hear that in the same way that Esther identifies with her people, Jesus, when he steps into the waters of baptism and hears the words of the Father say to him, "This is my Son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased." And then to know that because our lives are hidden with God in Christ, those words are also spoken to us. It's one thing to know that, but does it really center you? Do you live out of that reality? And I think for most of us, this just runs totally contrary to how we think of ourselves. We navigate life sometimes aware of this approval from God, but mostly attuned to the cacophony of other voices that, those harsh words that we carry with us, harsh words that others have stamped over us. And we go through life trying to build up immunity to those voices, piling on ways to get noticed. But like Haman, as soon as we're criticized, as soon as we're left alone, all of those things that we have done to inoculate us fall away like dominoes and all the other voices come crowding in. And so like Esther, we need practices. We need a means that will allow us to attune to the voice from above, the voice of the God who pronounces favor over us. That is the only voice that can drown out the voices that would have you spending your time and your energy consumed by the need to get your sense of well-being from the words and the perceptions of others. Otherwise, your joy will be controlled by others' approval. And whenever that approval is not there, your joy will evaporate. And so it is that when we live for the approval of others, it makes the world seem smaller than it really is. And if the need for others' esteem is all that you have, it quickly becomes all that there is. We see this in Haman, that his emotions are simply an external expression of the inward reality of his soul. And we all know what that's like. We all have people who just live rent-free in our heads. We know what it's like to be surrounded by people who will encourage us not to kill off our pride, but to nurture it instead. Haman, when he tells his wife this, she's like, well, why don't you just get a pole and impale the guy? Like you do. Where is your joy connected to other people's approval? Where is your fear connected to their approval? For Esther, freedom comes when she is no longer concerned about securing a life on the false security of her own comfort and her status. And when that happens, she is able to find her life within the larger scope of God's gracious disposition to her people. She has repeatedly throughout the story found favor, but she no longer rises or falls on finding it from Xerxes, and this allows her to lead with courage, with compassion, with wisdom, and so it is with us. And because Jesus has identified with us, we have the strength to approach this table, no longer fearful of the king's wrath, but knowing that he has identified with us, called us his beloved, welcomed us as guests invited to his table.